The Eastern Front of World War II was the largest and deadliest theater of warfare in human history. From the frozen outskirts of Leningrad to the ruins of Stalingrad and the burning streets of Berlin, the struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union determined the fate of Europe. More than any other front, it was here that Adolf Hitler's Third Reich was broken. This is the story of how the Eastern Front was won and why Germany ultimately lost. 1. Hitler's Gamble, Operation Barbarossa. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, surged across a 1,800-mile front into Soviet territory. Hitler believed the Soviet Union was weak. Stalin's purges had crippled the Red Army's leadership, and German victories in Poland and France had been swift and devastating. The Nazi goal was simple: destroy the Red Army, capture key cities, Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, seize Ukraine's farmland, and the Caucasus oil fields. Germany expected victory within 5 months. At first, everything went according to plan. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. By the end of 1941, the Red Army had lost over 3 million soldiers killed or captured. But Germany had made a fatal mistake. It underestimated Soviet resilience and geography. 2. The Soviet Union refuses to collapse. Instead of surrendering, the USSR mobilized its entire society for war. Factories were dismantled and moved beyond the Ural Mountains, out of reach of German bombers. Women, teenagers, and the elderly worked 12 to 16-hour shifts producing tanks, rifles, and artillery. By 1942, Soviet factories were outproducing Germany. At the same time, Stalin declared the war a Great Patriotic War. It became a fight for survival, not ideology. Soviet soldiers knew defeat meant enslavement or death. German brutality made this even worse. The Nazis treated Slavs as subhumans and massacred civilians and prisoners. Instead of being welcomed as liberators, German forces created millions of determined enemies. 3. Moscow, the first German failure. By autumn 1941, German armies stood just miles from Moscow. But winter arrived early, and German troops were unprepared for the cold. Vehicles froze, weapons jammed, and supply lines stretched thousands of kilometers. Meanwhile, Soviet reinforcements from Siberia, trained for winter warfare, arrived. In December, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive, pushing the Germans back. For the first time in the war, Germany suffered a major defeat. Blitzkrieg had failed. 4. Stalingrad, the turning point. In 1942, Hitler shifted his focus south toward oil. This led to the battle for Stalingrad, a city that became the most brutal battlefield in history. For months, German and Soviet troops fought room by room, floor by floor. Casualties were horrifying. But while the Germans were focused on the city, the Soviets prepared a trap. In November 1942, Operation Uranus encircled the German Sixth Army. Over 300,000 Axis troops were trapped. Hitler refused to allow retreat. By February 1943, the starving, freezing German army surrendered. It was the worst defeat in German military history and shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. 5. Kursk, the last German offensive. In summer 1943, Germany attempted one final massive attack at Kursk, the largest tank battle ever fought. But Soviet intelligence knew the plan. They built deep defensive lines with mines, trenches, and anti-tank guns. When the Germans attacked, they were bled white. After Kursk, Germany lost the ability to launch large offensives in the east. The Red Army now held permanent strategic initiative. 6. The Red Army rolls west. From 1944 onward, Soviet forces pushed relentlessly westward. Using overwhelming numbers of men, tanks, and artillery, they destroyed German armies across Eastern Europe. Cities fell one by one: Kiev, Minsk, Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna. In April 1945, Soviet troops reached Berlin. 7. The fall of Berlin. The final battle was savage. Soviet soldiers fought through ruins against desperate German defenders. On April 30, 1945, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. A week later, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. 8. Why the Eastern Front was won. The Soviet victory came from several key factors. Industrial power. The USSR outproduced Germany in tanks, artillery, and aircraft after 1942. Manpower. The Red Army absorbed terrible losses but kept fighting. The Soviet Union lost over 27 million people. Geography and climate. Russia's vast distances and brutal winters destroyed German logistics. German mistakes. Hitler interfered with military strategy, split forces, and refused retreats. Soviet adaptation. The Red Army learned from early defeats and became highly effective by 1943. Conclusion. The Eastern Front was the heart of World War II. It was not won by a single battle, but by endurance, sacrifice, and industrial strength. Germany entered the Soviet Union expecting a quick victory. Instead, it found a war of annihilation and was destroyed by it. More than any Allied army, it was the Red Army that broke Nazi Germany. By the time American and British forces landed in Western Europe, Hitler had already lost the war in the East. The road to Berlin was paved in blood, but it was the Eastern Front that decided the fate of the Third Reich. The human cost of victory. The Eastern Front was not just a clash of armies. It was a war against entire populations. More than 70% of all German military deaths occurred on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union lost more than 27 million people, including soldiers and civilians. Entire cities were destroyed. Leningrad lost over 1 million people during its 900-day siege. Stalingrad was reduced to rubble. Thousands of villages across Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia were burned. This was a war of extermination. Nazi forces carried out mass executions, starvation campaigns, and genocide. Soviet soldiers, knowing what defeat meant, fought with unmatched determination. 10. Soviet War Doctrine, from chaos to mastery. In 1941, the Red Army was poorly led and badly organized, but it adapted. By 1943, Soviet commanders had developed a new way of fighting called deep battle. First, massive artillery bombardments shattered German defenses. Then tanks and mechanized infantry broke through. Finally, fast-moving forces surrounded German armies. Instead of just pushing forward, the Red Army now destroyed entire German formations, preventing them from regrouping. This made Soviet offensives devastatingly effective. 11. Germany was fighting a war. It could not win. By 1943, Germany faced an impossible situation. The Soviet Union in the East, Britain, and the USA in the West, strategic bombing destroying German cities. Shortages of fuel, men, and equipment. Germany could not replace its losses. The USSR could. Each Soviet offensive weakened Germany beyond recovery. 12. The Red Army enters Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces advanced, they liberated and occupied countries previously under Nazi control. However, victory brought a new reality. In Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and East Germany, the Red Army established pro-Soviet governments. The war against Germany had also become the foundation of the Cold War. 13. The psychological impact on Germany. German soldiers on the Eastern Front experienced constant fear. Endless Soviet artillery, massive tank attacks, partisan warfare behind their lines. By 1944, many German troops knew the war was lost. Morale collapsed, desertions increased, and entire units surrendered. 14. Why the Eastern Front decided World War II. While D-Day and the Western Front were important, they were not decisive. By the time Allied troops landed in France, Germany had already lost millions of soldiers in the East. Its best armies were destroyed. Its oil supply was gone. The Red Army had already broken the backbone of the Wehrmacht. Final thoughts. The war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union was not just a military contest. It was a fight for survival, ideology, and the future of Europe. Germany lost not because it lacked brave soldiers or powerful weapons, but because it challenged a nation that could. Absorb massive losses, outproduce its enemy, learn from its mistakes, and fight to the very end. The Eastern Front was the greatest battlefield in history, and it was there that Hitler's dream of conquest was buried. 15. The commanders who shaped the war, Soviet generals. The Soviet victory was not just about numbers. It was about leadership that improved over time. Georgy Zhukov, the most important Soviet general. He organized the defense of Moscow, helped plan Stalingrad's counterattack, and later led the final assault on Berlin. Zhukov understood how to use massive forces effectively. Konstantin Rokossovsky, a master of defensive and offensive warfare. He played a key role at Stalingrad and in the destruction of German forces in Belarus in 1944. Ivan Konev, one of the main commanders in the push into Eastern Europe and Germany. These men learned from early defeats and turned the Red Army into a deadly war machine. German commanders. Germany also had brilliant generals. Erich von Manstein, perhaps Germany's best strategist. He designed many successful counterattacks, including early victories in Ukraine. Heinz Guderian, the father of German tank warfare. His blitzkrieg tactics destroyed Soviet armies in 1941. However, their skill was undermined by Hitler, who refused to allow retreats and made many decisions based on ideology rather than military reality. 16. The Tank War. The Eastern Front was a war of steel. German tanks Panzer III and IV. Effective early on Tiger. Powerful but expensive and slow to build Panther. Deadly but mechanically unreliable. Soviet tanks T-34. Fast, cheap, easy to repair, and extremely effective KV-1 and IS-2. Heavy tanks that crushed German defenses. 17. Artillery, the true king of the battlefield. More than tanks or planes, artillery decided battles. The Red Army used enormous artillery barrages to destroy German defenses before attacks. Soviet rockets, called Katyushas, rained explosives over entire areas, crushing morale. German troops feared Soviet artillery more than anything else. 18. Air power. Early in the war, Germany dominated the skies. But by 1943, the Soviet Air Force was strong and growing. Soviet planes protected ground troops, attacked German supply lines, supported tank advances. Germany could no longer control the air, making it harder to stop Soviet offensives. 19. Why technology did not save Germany. Germany had advanced weapons, but they were too complex, too expensive, too slow to produce. The USSR built weapons that were simple, reliable, mass-produced. In total war, production matters more than perfection. 20. The secret war behind German lines. While massive armies clashed at the front, another war was being fought in forests, villages, and railways behind German lines. Millions of civilians in occupied Soviet territory joined partisan movements. These fighters blew up railroads, ambushed German patrols, assassinated collaborators, disrupted supply lines. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of partisans were operating across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. They forced Germany to divert entire divisions just to guard supply routes, weakening the front. 21. Soviet intelligence and deception. The Soviet Union also fought with information. Soviet spies operated in Germany, Switzerland, and even Japan. One famous agent, Richard Sorge, warned Stalin of Germany's invasion plans and later confirmed that Japan would not attack Siberia. This allowed the USSR to transfer troops to defend Moscow. Soviet military deception, called maskirovka, hid troop movements and misled German commanders. Before major offensives, fake armies and radio traffic fooled the Germans into moving their forces in the wrong direction. This gave the Red Army surprise at key moments like Stalingrad in Operation Bagration. 22nd Operation Bagration, Germany's greatest defeat. In summer 1944, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, the largest Soviet offensive of the war. It destroyed Germany's Army Group Center, wiping out 28 divisions, over 300,000 German soldiers. The Germans never recovered. The path to Berlin was open. This was a disaster far greater than Stalingrad, yet it is less known in the West. 23. The Red Army reaches the Reich. By 1945, Soviet forces were deep inside Germany. They crossed the Oder River and prepared for the final battle. Germany was out of fuel, out of men, and out of hope. The Eastern Front had become a one-way road toward Berlin. 24. The birth of the Cold War. When the guns fell silent, Europe was divided. The Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe. The Western Allies controlled the West. The same Red Army that crushed Nazi Germany now stood face-to-face with NATO forces. The victory over Germany led directly to the division of Germany, the Iron Curtain. The Cold War. The Eastern Front didn't just end World War II, it created the modern world. Final words. The war between Russia and Germany was not just a chapter of World War II. It was the core of the entire conflict. The Soviet Union did not win easily. It won through sacrifice, industry, intelligence, and relentless pressure. The defeat of Nazi Germany was forged not on the beaches of Normandy, but in the snows of Russia and the ruins of Stalingrad. 25. The true lessons of the Eastern Front. The war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shattered many military myths. Speed does not win long wars. Germany's blitzkrieg worked against small countries, but failed against a vast, industrialized nation. Deep territory, huge manpower, and national mobilization made quick victory impossible. Industry is a weapon. The USSR produced more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition. Even when losing territory, Soviet factories kept supplying the front. Adaptation beats perfection. German weapons were often superior in design. Soviet weapons were simpler and easier to replace. In total war, what you can build and repair matters more than what is technically better. 26. The myth of German invincibility. Before 1941, the German army was seen as unstoppable. The Eastern Front destroyed this illusion. Stalingrad, Kursk, and Operation Bagration proved that. German armies could be surrounded. German morale could break. German generals could be outplayed. From that point on, Germany was fighting only to delay defeat. 27. Why the Soviet victory still matters today. The modern borders of Eastern Europe, the rise of Russia as a global power, and the division of Europe after the war all came from this struggle. The Eastern Front shaped NATO versus Russia. The Cold War, Europe's political map. World War II in Europe was decided not in France but in the East. 28. A war like no other. No other conflict used more soldiers, killed more people, destroyed more cities, or reshaped the world more deeply. The war between Germany and the Soviet Union was history's greatest clash of nations. Conclusion. How the Eastern Front was won. Germany lost because it tried to conquer a land too vast, a people too determined, and an enemy that learned how to fight back. The Soviet Union won because it mobilized its entire society, outproduced its enemy, absorbed terrible losses, and never surrendered. From Moscow to Berlin, the Red Army pushed forward until the Nazi state collapsed. The Eastern Front was the graveyard of Hitler's empire, in the birthplace of the modern world. 29. The price of victory. The Soviet victory came at a terrible cost. Entire generations were lost. In some regions, 1 in every 3 people died. Families were wiped out. Cities had to be rebuilt from ashes. Even after the war, millions of veterans returned home wounded, traumatized, and often forgotten. The USSR won, but its people paid a price no nation should ever have to pay. 30. The dark side of liberation. As the Red Army advanced into Eastern Europe and Germany, it brought freedom from Nazi rule, but also new suffering. There were looting, violence, political repression. Many Eastern Europeans soon realized they had exchanged one form of domination for another. This created bitterness that still affects relations today. History on the Eastern Front is not simple hero versus villain. It is tragedy layered upon tragedy. 31. How the war is remembered. In Russia, the war is remembered as the Great Patriotic War, a story of heroism, unity, and survival. In Eastern Europe, memory is more complicated. Nazis were defeated, but Soviet control followed. In Germany, the Eastern Front is remembered as a disaster born of dictatorship and arrogance. These different memories shape modern politics, especially tensions between Russia and its neighbors. 32. Why the Eastern Front still matters. Today's conflicts, borders, and alliances in Europe all trace back to this war. The Soviet victory created modern Russia's identity, shaped NATO and the EU, divided Europe for 45 years. The echoes of Stalingrad and Berlin are still heard in world politics. Final reflection. The Eastern Front was not just the place where Nazi Germany was defeated. It was where the modern world was forged. It showed how ideology can drive nations to extremes, how industrial power decides wars, how human endurance can outlast even the most brutal enemy. Russia versus Germany was the greatest clash of armies ever, and it changed history forever. 33. Could Germany have won the Eastern Front? At first glance, it looks possible. In 1941, the Red Army was in chaos. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured. German troops were at the gates of Moscow. So why didn't Germany win? Because victory required more than battlefield success. It required total control over a massive continent, and Germany simply lacked the resources. 34. The supply problem that killed the Reich. Germany depended on horses for transport, limited oil supplies, captured Soviet railways that used different tracks. Every kilometer east made German armies weaker. Food, ammunition, and fuel took weeks to arrive. The Red Army, fighting on its own land, had much shorter supply lines. Germany could not sustain a long war in Russia, no matter how many battles it won early. 35. What if Moscow had fallen? Even if Moscow had fallen in 1941, the Soviet government would have moved east. Factories were already beyond German reach. Millions of soldiers remained. The USSR did not depend on one city. It depended on its vastness. France collapsed because it was small. Russia could not. 36. Hitler's ideology guaranteed defeat. Nazi racial policy destroyed any chance of cooperation. Millions of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians initially hated Stalin. Many might have supported Germany. Instead, they were starved, executed, enslaved. Germany turned potential allies into enemies. 37.